Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the entire Tidelift team, welcome to Upstream 2023 edition. Our theme today is the accidental supply chain. I'm excited to share a great lineup of speakers today, and this talk will set the table for them by explaining what we mean when we say accidental supply chain and why it matters. Before we talk about accidental supply chains and explain why we chose that as this year's theme, let's talk first about intentional supply chains. Why is the entire industry and the White House and the European Parliament talking about software supply chains? Superficially, the modern open source software stack looks a lot like a quintessential supply chain. Someone produces a tiny thing, the next link in the chain combines that with other tiny things to make a medium-sized thing, and yet another link in the chain combines with other medium-sized things to make a big, valuable thing. In fact, this is perhaps the most valuable supply chain that's ever been built. Software ate the world, and the open source supply chain ate software. So if this is the most valuable supply chain that's ever been built, it's perhaps no surprise that industry and governments are simultaneously worrying about it. We've seen an increase in software supply chain attacks, both through open source projects like Upstream and through proprietary software like SolarWinds. We've also seen supply chain fragility like Log4j, where the supply chain itself was not attacked, and open source maintainers did the best they could. But nevertheless, one link of the chain broke, and so all consumers of the chain were open to exploit. Not surprisingly, companies and governments have responded to these active attacks and this passive fragility. Here, Jen Easterly puts it bluntly: everyone, up to CEOs and shareholders, needs to be concerned about cyber risk, of which supply chains are a big part. So that's why everyone is talking about the software supply chain, but why are we here today talking about the accidental supply chain? I think fundamentally we are in a period where two worlds, two perspectives really, are coming together in a very awkward way. What are these two perspectives? Quite simply, many of the people involved disagree about whether open source is or is not a supply chain. How you see that question very much depends on who you are and how you're looking at the problem. If you're looking at it from the perspective of people who consume open, it is very obviously a supply chain. Maybe not so much for those who produce open software. For those people, this supply is at best an accidental supply chain. Let's break it down a bit more. So what's the first argument for this being a supply chain? Simple. As has been recounted until we are all sick of it, this supply chain supports the core of the global economy. Every software company, every company that wants to be a software company, every company that does something else and is still a software company anyway. Or to put it another way, this fits one of the most basic definitions of a supply chain because a lot of money is changing hands from one link in the chain to the next. So what's the first reason it's not a supply chain? Well, since the beginning of open source, the median number of maintainers on open source projects has been one. Not one company, not one group of maintainers, one person. Global supply chains are not built of solo artisans. And we can see, based on data from Tidelift's latest survey, that at least 60% of maintainers self-describe as unpaid hobbyists. Global supply chains are not built on solo artisans, neither are they built on unpaid solo artisans. I cannot stress enough, the projects you see on stage at most big open source conferences are important, but not typical. Someone at a Linux Foundation event recently told me that they were part of a small project with only 15 maintainers. It was all I could do not to shout at them, "You're part of the 1%. This person wasn't malintentioned, but since I'm in the weeds of our customer supply chain data every day, I know that there are thousands of packages in use that are maintained by solo maintainers. So if you take away only two things today, one of them should be that most of the links in your supply chain are individual human beings. And you can even meet some of them later today. So let's flip back. Again, how is open source a supply chain? Supply chains are chains because each link in the chain abstracts away some complexity. One end of the chain doesn't need to know and often doesn't want to know what's at the other end of the chain. The software supply chain is perhaps the ultimate extension of this vision. Well-defined APIs and easy-to-use package downloaders allow many software developers to chain together huge strings of software without thinking very much about any individual link or even knowing how many links there are. I'll spare you all the XKCD comic, but you've all seen it. Take a second to picture it. All right, you did it. Let's move on. Again, how is this not a supply chain? Compare and contrast. The way that complexity is managed in traditional supply chains is through hard work by both the consumer and provider at each step of the chain. There are elaborate contracts, detailed specifications, exacting delivery mechanisms. It's hard to be a supplier without experiencing that work. Open source maintainers, on the other hand, just hit publish to GitHub and their package manager. After that, if they want, they can know nothing about the next step in the chain. You can become someone with millions of companies dependent on you and not know that, if you turn off GitHub issues and pull requests. There's no contracts to sign, no specifications to follow. You just do it. In other words, maintainers can simply choose not to experience the complexity of being part of a supply chain. Traditional supply chains are by now incredibly regulated, with everything from codes of labor ethics in the garment industry supply chains, to safety controls in food supply chains, to life cycle carbon auditing in heavy industry supply chains. That regulation has absolutely come to software, making it a supply chain like many others. In software, this regulation started with industry self-regulation, like the OpenSSF scorecards and SALSA. Now it's moving to an acronym soup of formal regulations. NIST's SSDF, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the EU's CRA, and my personal favorite, OMB M2218. So in that sense, this regulatory sense, this is very much a supply chain. On the other hand, if you regulate a commercial supplier that has a legal department, the supplier's legal department will monitor regulations and help the company comply. If you regulate an open source maintainer, their response will 90% of the time be to have no idea that they're regulated, 5% of the time actively snub the regulation, and as best as I can tell, 5% of the time they find me on Twitter. I'm their legal department, and I'm here to tell you that I don't scale. So the open source supply chain is regulated, but it's regulated like regulating cats. If you're regulating cats, is it really regulation? And if it's only barely regulated, is it really a supply chain? The answer, at least to the cats, is probably not. Finally, the software supply chain is very much a supply chain in the most basic sense. It is a chain of people supplying things. But there's one final huge difference too. The huge difference is, I think, the single most important point for you to take away today. In every other supply chain in the world, the people involved think of themselves as being a supplier. In contrast, ask open source maintainers to pick 100 words describing themselves. They'll say hacker, or developer, or maintainer, or hobbyist, or dog walker, or parent who does software on the side. One thing they won't say is supplier. That simple choice of word, that self-identification, tells you a lot about how they behave when they're made part of a supply chain. That's the paradox of the accidental supply chain. The term supply chain management was invented in the 1980s. The term supply chain was coined in 1905. Actual supply chains are at least as old as the Industrial Revolution, if not the Silk Road. So we have literally centuries of institutions and practices around supply chains, but they all apply to people, or almost exclusively companies, really, who know they are suppliers, who think of themselves as suppliers, whose job it is to supply things. We are building the first global, commercial, regulated supply chain that is composed of unpaid volunteers who don't think of themselves as suppliers. That's the paradox that will thread through every conversation today. And so today, we're going to explore this accidental, paradoxical supply chain. Who's a part of it? How do they feel about it? What are we as an industry doing, or not, to support them? I've had the privilege of interviewing many of our speakers and knowing many more of them for a long time. I'm very excited that we've been able to put these together and share them with you today. I won't list every speaker here, but we're going to see some great talks covering everything from individual maintainers like Val Karpov, to communities with Anita Human, to nonprofits like Eclipse, to very, very for-profits like Boeing and Cisco. We're also going to explore other supply chains, voting machines, AI, my 7-year-old son's favorite, trains. When I put this track together, my goal was to find supply chains outside of software, but it quickly became clear that in 2023, all supply chains are, to some extent, software supply chains. So you'll find these speakers talking about how these other areas are cross-pollinating with software's view of the world. I hope you find it as interesting and provocative as I did. Having given you this quick preview of all the ways we'll look at the accidental supply chain today, I want to circle back around to the beginning. What does it mean for us to have come from a community of self-identified hackers to become a community of not self-identified suppliers? Mike Milinkovich of Eclipse will talk about winning a lot later today, so I won't go into depth, but hey, we did win. I'm quite serious. Take a moment, pat yourself on the back, do a little dance. We won, we've succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. And really, this applies to everyone here. Even if you're just an evangelist, even if you're just a user, even if you've never written a line of code, you've helped contribute, even in your small way, to the win of open source. So step back from your keyboard, pat yourself on the back yet again. All right, pat ourselves on the back, we've done our dance, we won. Now what? Inevitably, as we've become both the most successful and the most complex supply chain ever created, people want to understand us. And because we, in fact, contain multitudes, the only way that they could understand us was to understand us at scale. It was no longer enough to trust our own experiences in the IRC channels and mailing lists of the late 90s. We have to understand millions of projects or we can't see the whole picture. The sociologist historian James C. Scott talks about a related problem in his classic work, Seeing Like a State. In that book, Scott talks about how early modern governments, faced with the challenge of knowing things about something as big as an entire modern nation, had to start by grossly oversimplifying things, going from the top down to cram complex, gnarly facts into simple boxes so that they could be counted. You didn't have a last name? Congratulations, we made one up. You have one now so that you can be put in the census and so you can be taxed. Have a last name with too many weird characters? Well, say goodbye to that too. That one, of course, is not just a problem for early modern governments, it's a problem for modern governments too. Your forest has too many different kinds of trees? Well, we'll just cut down the ones we don't like so that the remaining ones grow taller and straighter and can be chopped into lumber more easily. I hope you didn't need any of the ones that we cut down. This simplification coming from the top down does help understanding. When you have millions of people, millions of trees, millions of software projects, they're now countable, categorizable, understandable. But lots of work has to be done to cram those wild things into unwild boxes, and lots of rich, powerful nuance can be lost. In open source, the process of being seen in this top-down structured way started with licensing. There was one regulation that mattered to us early on, and that was copyright law. So we developed standards, informal at first, more formal later, and then tools, minimal at first, baroquely over-engineered later, to allow us to pretend to understand what was in our systems. 20 years in, this still doesn't work. Why not? The answer is fairly straightforward. Making this data accurate enough for companies with giant legal teams for consumption at the end of the open source supply chain created more work for maintainers. It made them suppliers of legal information. Except they weren't trained to supply this information. They mostly didn't know why anyone cared. They didn't enjoy supplying it. And it was very clear that it was extremely important to massive and massively profitable companies, but weirdly not important enough for those companies to pay for the work. So now result, 20 years in, licensing metadata is still a mess. Okay, so now what? I've written a bit on Tidelift's blog about the notion of an unfunded mandate. The classic unfunded mandate in the United States is when the federal government passes a new rule requiring state or local governments to do a thing without also providing funding for it. A classic, well-intended example is the Clean Air Act, which requires local governments to do a lot of work, but when passed, didn't provide funding for that work to be done. Not surprisingly, it took a long time for the work to get done, wasn't always done very well, and that's even with the advantage the federal government has of having a judicial and police system to help enforce the law. Look, unfunded mandates aren't necessarily bad. We really did need the Clean Air Act, and we really do need lots of open source security work. No one here is a bad person or a bad company or a bad government for wanting to improve that state of things. But if we ask maintainers to do new work without giving them new motivation, new resources, new time, it may not matter if the work is well-intentioned. It probably won't get done. The definition of insanity, some say, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Or in this case, asking the same accidental supply chain to supply new, boring, hard work over and over again and expecting them to suddenly morph from part-time hackers into rigorous, predictable suppliers. We know from both our surveys and the deep design experiments we've been doing at Tidelift that paid maintainers do more of the core, boring work of the supply chain when they're paid. This chart from our survey reporting shows large gaps in many key areas like two-factor authentication, vulnerability reporting practices, and peer review between maintainers who are paid and who aren't. Again, I need to stress, this is not a knock on paid maintainers. This is very reasonable behavior for hobbyists. I don't want to do this on my weekends. Again, the fact that this hobby has accidentally, unintentionally become the center of the global software supply chain, that's where the problem is. So if we keep going down the road of unfunded mandates, if we keep adding straw to the camel's back, what's going to happen? I think we should be clear. The answer is that open source maintainers are going to break. At the end of this talk, we'll show you a brief conversation with Jordan Harband, a JavaScript developer who helped pick up the pieces when another maintainer of widely used JavaScript packages deleted their GitHub account. Why'd they do that? When I heard the story, I was surprised too. We've already talked about the many, many new obligations being placed on maintainers, the alphabet soup, and I've been thinking about that problem for years. But in this case, it was something much simpler. The maintainer just didn't want to do two-factor authentication. I disagree with that. I think everybody should do 2FA. But every maintainer is going to draw their own line. And some, increasingly I fear many maintainers, are going to walk away when those lines are crossed. Again, the data here is grim. A majority of open source maintainers have either quit or considered quitting their projects. And that's of the people who have stayed engaged enough to answer our survey. The numbers are going to be much worse for those who aren't on Twitter anymore. We know from academic research out of CMU that many more just vanish altogether. So if we're going to continue to insist on making more straw, we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing for the camels? Are we building camel hospitals? Are we doing preventative camel care? Or are our camels, faced with one more straw, going to do the most reasonable thing? Find a nice date tree, wander off into the desert, and leave the multi-trillion-dollar software industry with a pile of unmaintained, insecure software. The early Obama slogan, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," is grammatically somewhat awkward, befitting its origin in protest poetry, and Obama eventually stopped using it. But as a lifelong participant in open communities, it always stuck with me. Faced with the challenge of the accidental supply chain, we can sit and point fingers and wait for someone to save us, or we can become the ones we are waiting for, the ones who have solutions. In this conference today, we have leaders from every branch of human activity. We have bold solo volunteers, patient public servants, constructive capitalists, and yes, to hark back to Obama, even community organizers. So let's talk about how we can be the ones who we've been waiting for, how we can solve these problems. Let's start with what won't work. I was asked by a well-meaning policy person recently, essentially, what if we required all companies to participate in open source? This was, as I say, well-intentioned. But participation ends up having the wrong focus because it tends to focus on the links in the supply chain that are closest to us, or the links we can address in an automated way. In that case, we end up doing things like supporting the same popular, well-known, top-level projects. It's not a bad thing, but it ignores the 99% of projects that are in our dependency trees, but are anonymous until a project comes up. Or we end up trying to address the whole chain through things like automated pull requests. That scales for the people sending the pull requests, but it's inhuman and hostile to the recipients, exactly because of their accidental participation in the supply chain. Instead, we need solutions that acknowledge that this is a supply chain and that solutions must simultaneously scale and be human for the entire supply chain, not just the first or second link out from supply chain consumers. So if just participating harder won't work because it's limited to the first few links in the chain, what kinds of solutions might recognize the accidental supply chain nature of these problems? Let's recall from the very beginning of this talk that the median number of maintainers is, and has long been, 1. So when I say design technical requirements with representative maintainers here, I really mean solo maintainers. If you don't have solo maintainers as part of your feedback loop on any proposed supply chain standard, you're not getting good feedback. You wouldn't ship a product without doing extensive product design work with its most numerous users, and you should hold any team that is designing open source supply chain requirements to the same standard. Lauren Hanford, Tidelift's VP of Product, will be talking later today about how we've done this at Tidelift, and I'm really excited about what she's going to show you. The results are really impressive when you work together with maintainers. Just as this is true for technical requirements, it should be true for governments as well. If the only folks at the table when new government software regulations are proposed are the biggest foundations, or worse, just the largest proprietary software companies, those regulations may be a disaster. Mike Milinkovich of the Eclipse Foundation will be talking later today about what the EU is or isn't doing in this regard. Spoiler alert, mostly isn't. Mike, along with a group of many others, have been doing great thoughtful work in this regards on the EU CRA. But it's been a fire drill, exactly because maintainers weren't consulted during the initial drafting. As you'll see in my upcoming chat with Jordan, another way to resolve the supply chain paradox is to help maintainers cover for each other. In other words, make them less solo and build parallel links in the chain. We're already doing this at Tidelift by helping maintainers pick up otherwise abandoned projects, providing a small but growing lifter community, and experimenting with peering. My long-held dream is that someday we'll even be able to offer vacations. What else can we do? As we build a system that respects maintainers more by listening to them and building their network, we must also build their motivation. I need to stress that most maintainers want to do what's right, especially around security, an area many of them are both curious about and take pride in. But that motivation, that desire to do better around security, is not infinite. Neither is their time. Just as they haven't done our industry's licensing paperwork for 20 years, they won't be beating down the door to fulfill our secure supply chain requirements either. That means, to get this done, we need to motivate them. That means we need to pay them. At Tidelift, we've paid out millions of dollars to open source maintainers in the past 6 years, exactly to help ease that transition from maintainer to supplier. As part of that, we're now specifically paying maintainers to validate that their packages meet important security and maintenance standards like those outlined in the NIST SSDF, OpenSSF scorecards, etc. And we're seeing big results with big jumps on OpenSSF scorecards in projects that we've worked with. We're going to continue to expand on that as the external community and our customers demand it. Finally, though we're most famous for paying maintainers, paying them is only step one. As an industry, we have to start with paying maintainers, but we must conclude with a commitment to help those maintainers thrive. Only then will they become excited, permanent suppliers rather than accidental, transitory suppliers. Data from our survey shows that maintainers want money first and foremost, but they also want other forms of support, including peering, networking, and mentorship. To find out more about this, check out several chats with maintainers throughout the day, especially our Maintainer State of the Union, as well as the thoughtful keynotes from Julia Ferroli and Nithya Ruff on the human factors in this supply chain. So, in conclusion, we need to replace the accidental supply chain with an intentional supply chain. And we need to do that with intentional, thriving maintainer suppliers. We can build this better supply chain if we, all of us, recognize that maintainers don't see themselves as suppliers yet, even though we use them as a supply chain. We can build this better supply chain if we, all of us, fund our new mandates rather than just throwing them at the wall to see what sticks. We can build this better supply chain if we, all of us, design new requirements and systems in partnerships with all maintainers, especially solo maintainers. All of us are going to have to do our part to make this happen. We hope today that we'll give you the tools to go back to your home organizations and start building that better, thriving, intentional supply chain. Thank you, and enjoy the day. Hi, Jordan. Great to see
Hi,
you.
glad to be here.
We're talking today about what happens when packages go unmaintained and how they can, sometimes are, sometimes aren't rescued. Tell us about how you came across the situation with Minimist.
Yeah, sure. So in general, Substack and I have had a long relationship rapport. I maintain a number of his packages, and um, he and I had been talking on Twitter DM for about something or other, and he mentioned that I think I was asking him to fix something, and he mentioned that he was unable to log into NPM because of their two-factor requirement, and he didn't have a phone. His lifestyle is such that he doesn't have a cell phone. And I tried pointing out that like you can use a Chrome extension, you don't need a phone, and they have the email thing, and it just didn't seem to land. It sounds like he had just, burned that bridge as soon as he was told that was a requirement. So I said, okay, well, like it'd be great if you could and then so he indicated that he was going to be deleting his GitHub and like not using his NPM account. And I sort of had this moment of panic because not only do I maintain some of the projects I maintain were still under his username, but also a lot of the packages I maintain depend on things that he owned. And so I thought real quick and I was like, okay, here's these three, tape and a couple others, Tape's a test framework, and I was like, so I guess transfer me those. And he bounced them over to me. And I just kind of was like, okay, now what? And then I asked, and then also I suggested, hey, I'd love to take all your repos, because these are all, the majority of them are things a lot of people use and care about. They've been around a long time. Like it's important to the ecosystem, right? We don't want to just erase these. I said, I'll make an org, no problem. Like I can just, put you in an org and you put everything there. And his response was basically, well, sure. If there's a button that I can click to transfer them all at once, I'll do that. Right. No problem. And there isn't. So I said, okay, well, I'm happy to do it for you. Like we can do screen share and I can click on your account, or you can give me your credentials like right before you delete the account and I'll bounce everything over. Like just don't delete these repos. Like don't let them go to nothing. And I think he had, again, just sort of made his decision and he was like, it's too much effort for me. If there's a button, I'll click it. And since there's not, sorry. And then he started to delete his GitHub. And it took, because he has so many repos, it took a little while for that to take effect. And so there was a period of time where I was looking at that and I was like, oh, I can still access the repos. Maybe they'll stay up. Like maybe it's not so bad. And then of course, inevitably they all vanished away into existence, like Marty's family on that photograph on Back to the Future. And so I reached out to him and asked if I could get NPM ownership. So actually what I first tried to do is recover the Git history for Minimist, because that was the biggest one. And I was, so I went and I looked around and I found a few like severed forks that had, like, he had basically stopped publishing to Minimist a couple years ago. And then last year, he published a couple security updates to fix the CVE. And I had all the Git history from a few years ago, but not the last year's worth of recent updates. And that was just the best I could do. So I was looking at having to manually recreate Git commits based on just what was in the package at publish time, which is better than nothing, but it's not ideal. And so at that point, I started reaching out, trying to find anybody I knew at GitHub, you know, and NPM who had the ability to make this happen. And I reached out to you folks at Tidelift as well, because I figured the more levers being applied, the better, right? Like it's with Tidelift's help, I'm more than just some guy. Even though like GitHub and NPM roughly know who I am, right? I'm a known quantity. I'm still one person, and having organizations involved, I think, is a more confidence-inspiring argument to make.
Yeah, well, we were, of course, very happy to help you in those sort of frantic, oh no, what's going
Right.
on? I think I rolled out of bed, and that was one of the first things I saw when I rolled out of bed that
Good
morning.
morning.
Yeah, you know, all kinds of challenges, and this is one of them, right? Happy to support.
Sure.
You know, I think it's important to call out to the audience, you don't sound angry, or Substack didn't do anything particularly wrong here, right? I mean, maybe rude, but like, this is somebody who'd been, you know, tired for a while, it sounds like, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that he did not actively break anybody. He did not, right? There's, you know, he didn't try to remove things from NPM, which would have broken people and, you know, had happened before. He didn't hand his packages over to just random folks who wanted them. He was just like, no, I'm done. And it's certainly not what I would do, and it's not what I wanted him to do, but it's not my life. It's not, you know, it's his. He gets to make his decisions. And you know, I just was doing the best I could to be like, hey, like, please do whatever you can to help me like make this smoother. And luckily he was willing. He was corresponding with GitHub and NPM on email and confirming that yes, like it's okay that Jordan gets access to these things. And that step is required, because without that, I have a feeling nothing would have happened, because like, even though the outcome would have been the same for the packages in the ecosystem, I think GitHub is really cautious about putting themselves in a place where they could be, you know, considered to have misstepped or like done something wrong. And so they really needed to make sure that they had his permission. And luckily he was able to and willing to give it. So I mean, I'm grateful to him, even though I'm, you know, his actions created more work for me. And there are still a number of packages that are not recovered, but, you know, but nonetheless, like I appreciate that he was willing to work with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common thread throughout so many of these stories of maintainership and burden of maintainership is that the vast majority of people involved are very well intentioned, right? They're just
Yes.
trying to do the right thing, and maybe that's not always under the circumstances they expected, right?
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing is, I mean, Substack originally created these packages 2010, 2009. I mean, so well over a decade ago. And, you know, like that's a lot of basically free work, right? I mean, that at the time it was all a passion project for him. But nonetheless, people were getting value from his work for nothing.
Right.
And over time, the more, I mean, this applies to anyone, right? The more you have a package that gets heavy usage and adoption, the more burden is placed on you as people complain that things are broken, as people ask you to add features. You know, the CVE system often over targets because it's easier to target Minimist, for example, than it is to target the 3,000 projects that are using it poorly, right? And that creates burden on the maintainers as well. And, you know, I hope that I don't reach the point personally where that happens for me, but I cannot, like, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to judge anyone else for reaching that point. And if he's reached that point, then there it is.
Right. So, Jordan, tell us about the future of Minimist now that this has happened.
Yeah. Actually, amazingly, like, and this almost never happens in my projects, I had somebody step up to help maintain it, which is great. And it's somebody I've worked with. They maintain, Commander, another argument parser, and N, which is a node version manager that competes with NVM, the one I maintain. So like we've interacted in a number of different venues, and it worked out great. We had a video chat and, got on the same page about how we were going to maintain it. And, he now shares in the Tidelift revenue with me, which I'm happy to share. And so it's like, not only did I take this one over, but it no longer has a bus factor of 1, which I can't say about most of my projects.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's totally, I loved that. That warms my cold heart because, certainly one of those things we'd love for Tidelift's money to be able to help support is make sure that there is more people involved, because that's certainly best for the long-term health of the ecosystem.
Absolutely.
That's so cool to hear. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this, Jordan. It is, I think, one of these important and undertold stories for exactly that reason. So much of this started out of passion, which is terrific, but how do you turn passion into something that is maintainable in the long run, especially as our standards keep rising? And of course, that's what today will be about is, boy, the standards are rising for totally good, totally reasonable reasons.
Exactly.
And how are we as an ecosystem going to grapple with that? Well, thank you again so much for your time, Jordan. And thank you for taking on these packages. We all really appreciate it.
Happy to help.